Welcome, everyone, from Westside. We studied last night Genesis 24 and 25, and tonight we'll finish with chapters 26 and 27. That will make up lesson five. There's a lot of material in here, so we had to divide it into two. Some things we need to tie in from last night so that if you are picking this up, you'll make the connection. We, of course, have entered into Isaac and Rebekah. Clearly, has been the transition from Abraham and Sarah, now the second generation. And we come to the birth to Isaac and Rebekah of twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau is the older. And the boys, you remember, were struggling very violently in her womb. So she goes and inquires of the Lord. And the Lord says to her in the end of chapter 25, two nations are in your womb, and two peoples are going to come from these boys. The one will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. So primogeniture, the oldest being the one that should become the head of the family. We ought to say Abraham, Isaac, and Esau is turned on its head. The older is going to serve the younger, which is just unbelievable in that day and age. It was always the oldest son had the right to the birth order and therefore to rule the family when the father died, and then also to receive the double blessing. Now, remember that however many sons a man had, they divided the estate, his estate plus one. They added one more portion, divided it by that number, and then the oldest was given that double portion. For instance, of these two sons would have been three parts, and the two-thirds would go to the oldest. That would have been how things would have normally happened, but that's not how it's going to happen here. And this all plays into the chapter 27, where we'll spend most of our time tonight. The other thing, a couple of things we need to tie out of this chapter is that we're told at verse 28 that Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game and loved that food, and but it says of Rebekah that she loved Jacob. So that division in the house of where father is favoriting one son over the mother favoriting the other has huge implications of what's going to happen when the time of the blessing comes. The birthright had the blessing, and as we're going to see with the patriarchs, there is a prophetic nature. God is behind what they're speaking, has the force of God's words and blessings. So it's not just the wishes of a parent. God is prophetically guiding this. And so the other thing that happens at the very end of chapter 25 is that Esau sells his birthright. Remember that story that he just thinks he's going to die, and Jacob's been conniving and thinking about it. It says, "Sell me your birthright. I'll give you some of the food I'm cooking if you'll sell me your birthright." Esau says, "What good is my birthright going to do me if I die?" And so he sold it. The scripture clearly says he despised his birthright. All that was connected to that. Remember, even Jacob made him swear. So not just that he sold it, he swears to it. So he's given up all rights to that birth order and has shown that he has no concern for what he has been taught about. You remember, Abraham could have known him until he was 15, till they were 15 years old, and Isaac, what they would have taught him about God and about all that God has planned for the people. Esau has despised that. Esau is never looked at in the Scripture, Old or New Testament, in a good light, and for good reason. All right, so we begin chapter 26, where Isaac is going to have a lot of dealings with, again, the Philistines, the same people at Gerar that his father had dealt with many, many years before this. A famine has struck the land again, as famines often did in Palestine. This one is compared to that one that had happened back with Abraham and the disaster, as you remember there, about Abimelech taking Sarah into his house. So he is told clearly here not to go down to Egypt. That would have been the normal thing that somebody would have wanted to do. The certain food supplies there, the Nile floods almost always, therefore ensuring the crops. And Isaac is thinking about that. God forbids him. Remember the disaster that happened when Abraham went down. Because of the beauty of Sarah, Pharaoh took her into his harem and all of that disaster that ensued from that. God says, "Put your trust in me. I will be with you and I will bless you." And Isaac believes that. Isaac does that. So Isaac shows his faith in God. Sometimes we talk about how the commentaries give short riff to Isaac. He's sort of this benign figure that's between the exciting stories of Abraham and Jacob, and not very many chapters at all. There, very little is said about Isaac. But I think we're making a huge mistake if we don't think of Isaac's faith being great like his father and even like his son will become later in Jacob. Then at verses 3 through 5, for the first time it is recorded that we have it in the Bible. The promises are made to Isaac. So the same covenant that was made with Abraham is now reiterated to Isaac. Same promises of the offspring and the land and the future blessings that will come from the one that would descend from them through that we know as Jesus. And he says a very interesting thing at verse 5, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws, is why he is fulfilling this covenant with Isaac. But that will also have to be true of Isaac. He will need to keep, because God is making, before there's ever a written law, I want you to think about that, before there's ever a written law of Moses, God is speaking laws and statutes and commandments to both Abraham and to Isaac. And he is saying, I still require obedience. The conditions of the grace of the covenant. Grace is never something that is just without conditions. If man doesn't follow what God has graciously given, then and promised, if he doesn't keep his laws, then those promises are not going to come to pass unless God makes it one-sided, like he did with Noah when he made the covenant that I will never again destroy. It doesn't matter how evil men become, I'll never again destroy the earth with a flood. But the covenant with Abraham, and even as we think of the new covenant made with us in the New Testament, it is conditional. It's based upon our obedience to God. So we see Isaac coming then next to settle in Gerar, since God has told him to remain in the land. And remember, that's where Abraham encountered another Abimelech. The Abimelech is not to be seen as a personal name. There's arguments about this. It could be. We could think of Abimelech Senior, Abimelech Junior. I mean, Abimelech the Third. It's possible that that's true, but most believe it is like a dynastic name, like Pharaoh. There was Pharaoh Ramses, Pharaoh Seti, Pharaoh Tutankhamun, we know as King Tut. I mean, there were lots of different personal names, but the great house, that's what Pharaoh means, was the dynastic name of the Egyptian ruler. And it appears to be that is the case with the Philistines who dwell at Gerar. And so Abimelech, he goes and dwells there, and the men ask about Rebekah. So we have a repeat. Rebekah is beautiful, just like Sarah was. And Isaac does the same thing. Now, you have to remember that what it would have happened before was many years before this. And Isaac is repeating what his father did in saying, she is my sister. And clearly here, there is no connection as closely as it was that, remember, Abraham said that Sarah was his half sister. I mean, Rebekah is kin to Isaac, but in a distant relationship. But nonetheless, we see the same repeat. So a lot of times in liberal commentaries, they'll talk about how this obviously this couldn't have happened, and this is just a repeat of what happened with Abraham. I always find it incredible that men don't look at themselves. Do you not believe that you could fear the same way he did, and you wouldn't pull the same kind of shenanigans that somebody else that was even your father pulled before you? I mean, it's just more likely to accept the book at face value and not try to weave into it somehow the idea that this is just a repeat of Abraham and it was stuck in the text and made to be happening to Isaac when it really didn't happen. It's amazing to me sometimes what you read about what men write, rather than just accepting, as we look at human nature itself, know our own selves, and see that Isaac could just exactly repeat. And the same thing is said about Abraham doing it both in Egypt and among the Philistines. The same kind of liberal arguments are made about that. But we can see how people can be weak. We know ourselves, and we know that it's very likely for us to do the same kind of thing. But a very important point is made at verse 8 that Abimelech looked out his window one day and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. Now, that's the way it's translated in the English Standard. Interesting how many times laughter comes to play in some of the stories with Isaac, and that's what his name means. Now, the translators have translated this word, the Hebrew, variously, like showing endearment or caressing. Clearly, whatever he was doing, sporting, one version says, Uh, Whatever he was doing with Rebekah would have not been proper for someone to have do with a brother and sister relationship, but only a husband and wife. And so Abimelech calls him on the carpet and says, Rebekah's your wife. And what would have happened if one of the men, because on this occasion he doesn't take Rebekah into his harem and nobody has taken her. But what if somebody had, he says, and he calls him to account at verse 10. He says, what is this that you have done to us? Again, Isaac is upbraided by an unbeliever just as his father had done. How many times has that happened with you maybe in life or with me that we've been called on the carpet for something that we did that was wrong, and it's somebody that's not following God, that's not thinking about God. It is a deep rebuke when somebody that ought to be living by the laws and commandments of God is rebuked by somebody who doesn't. But again, there is this sense of ought, the fact that there are some common things that because we are made in the image of God, we know it's wrong to steal from people. We know it's wrong to murder somebody, to take their life. We know it's wrong to lie and cheat our way through life. If there never were written laws, we know that we don't want to be treated that way, and we know we ought not to treat somebody else that way. And that very idea of ought, what is this that you have done to us, argues for that common morality that exists in all men because they are created in the image of God. And we share that same basis of what we ought to do. And so Abimelech warns all of his people, as a good leader would have done. And Abimelech showing that there is fear still in that place. Remember that the Amorites' iniquity is not yet full, so there are still some who will do the right things until that cup is full, until they're so wicked that they must be destroyed when they come out of Egyptian captivity. 400 years, or more than that now, of course, 400 years they spend there. And so we're told that Isaac sows in the land at verse 12, and he reaps 100-fold. Whether that happened during this famine, but it seems to be in the text connected that way. Imagine in the best of times reaping that kind of quantity of grain, as maximum as you could reap, and yet this during a famine. So God is indeed blessing Isaac. And it says in the text, he became rich and gained more and became very wealthy, so that the Philistines envied him at verse 14. And then it says they feared him. And Abimelech says, go away from us, for you are much mightier than we are. And so the idea of fear there, and they want him to go away from him. What ensues after that is that as Isaac moves up the valley or moves into the valley of Gerar and digs a well, the Philistine herders come along and claim it for their own. So the first one was called Esek, or contention is what it means. Then they moved on and dug another one, Isaac's servants did, Sitnah, and again the Philistines contend for it, and it's called enmity. Finally, at verse 22, he digs a well that's called Rehoboth, and that means, for now the Lord has made room to us. The Philistines don't come and contend for that. And Rehoboth in the English Standard Footnote means broad places or room, that God has made room for them to dwell. Instead of, I think, seeing Isaac as a weak person, I think Isaac again is operating as a godly and faithful person ought to. Yes, he makes mistakes, as he has made about what we've seen about calling Rebekah his sister, but for the most part, he and Abraham both show themselves to be followers of God and to live like they ought to. When I think about a New Testament passage that relates to this in Romans chapter 12, what are we told to do as God's people? Look with me in Romans 12, beginning at verse 17. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, do not, never rather avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. So instead of taking his own matters into his own hand, fighting against the Philistines, and remember, they fear him. So remember Abraham going and defeating those armies with the men he had in his home house that were trained. How many more does Isaac have? I think we ought to see not weakness here, but meekness. That is, bringing strength under control, having the power to do something about it. but instead depending on God and waiting on God to deliver. And so God does. God grants them room. And then immediately after this, it says that God appeared to him and said, "Fear not, for I am with you, and I will bless you." And I'm sure Isaac needed those comforting words. How many times do we all need that? Sometimes we wish God could come and tell us that, but he does, folks, because of the Bible. We need to think about 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 4. May the God of all comfort you. And if you'll read that passage 3 or 4 more times, 2 or 3 more times, God said, or Paul says, that you be comforted, that you may be able to comfort others with the comfort that we receive from God. God is a God of all comfort, and he will take care of his people, and not just Abraham and Isaac. And we need to have confidence in that. So it says, as a result of that, Isaac built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord. So in the good way, like father, like son. We've seen the bad things, but like father, like son, Isaac builds an altar and worships. That idea of calling upon the name of the Lord is to worship God. In verses 26 through 33, the Philistines, of course, come now and they want to make a treaty with Isaac. They realize that he is great and powerful, and Isaac upbraids them on this occasion. You drove me away, and now you want to come and be friends. And they say that. They say, "We see plainly that the Lord is with you." And they invoke the name of Yahweh. It's all capitals there. Now, again, I don't think in any way that they were worshiping Yahweh. Remember, we suggested that about Laban and Bethuel, the family referring to Yahweh. They were idolaters too, even in Abraham's family there. But here it's just, I think, the idea that they're just invoking that's Isaac's God. And as Leupold said in his commentary, they do not think it's safe to be on bad terms with one who so manifestly stands in Yahweh's favor. I mean, everywhere Isaac turns, he just prospers and he gets richer and more powerful. At the end of this chapter, we're given again an insight into Esau's character, and it says to us in chapter 26 at the very end, when Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. But then it says they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. So again, I think it shows Esau's incapacity for spiritual values by the kind of wives he chooses to marry. Abraham strictly forbade Isaac to marry any Canaanites, and the Hittites are always listed. If you go and read the passages, and we'll look at one here in just a second, they're listed among those Canaanite nations that are going to be destroyed one day because of their ungodliness. Remember, the cup of their iniquity is not yet full. There's still some good ones, still some like Abimelech that can regard morality in marriage and fornication or adultery as being wrong and so forth. You have, as we saw, Melchizedek in Jerusalem. So there's still some rays of hope, but that is going to vanish. God knows in the future they're going to become more wicked and wicked. But the Canaanites even now show themselves to have that wickedness in them. These two women are not a blessing to Isaac and to Rebekah, but rather they are grief of mind and bitterness. Look with me, if you will, in Deuteronomy, the 7th chapter, when they will come into the land in the days, this is Moses talking to the children of Israel before they enter the land. It says, when the Lord your God, beginning with verse 1 of Deuteronomy 7, that you are to enter and take possession of it, and you clear away the many nations before you, the Hittites. They're the first ones he lists, and then it goes on through all those tribes. And these 7 nations that are more numerous and mighty than you, when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them and devote them to complete destruction because of their ungodliness, totality of their ungodliness, they are being judged. You'll make no covenant, show no mercy. Then listen to this: you shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. And that's in the book of Judges. That's exactly what we see. They did not follow God. They did exactly what he told them not to do. But again, Esau is showing himself not to be minded to marry someone who can be come over to the ways of the Lord. These two Hittite women are not interested in that, and they show themselves to be nothing but a bitterness to Isaac and Rebekah, and so cast more aspersion on the character of Esau. All right, in chapter 27, it just says to us when Isaac was old, he's thinking about the blessing that now must be given to follow the birthright. Now, we know he's 137 at this point, and I'll tell you how we get to that number. He'll live another 43 years. I mean, he's going to live a pretty good length of time still. He'll die at 180 in chapter 35 and verse 28. Now, Jacob tells us when he came into the land of Egypt many years later in 47:9 that he was 130 years old. Joseph, we know from tallying up his ages that are told, was 39 when Jacob came. So that means that Jacob was 91 years old when when Joseph was born. And Jacob was in his 14th year. Remember, he worked 7 years for Rachel, and so he had no relations with her until that night. Then Leah was substituted, and about a week later, he takes Rachel. And so he goes through all those years that Rachel can't give birth, and Leah's having one child after another. When you add up those 6, 7 children that are born at that time, at least you got to give them a year. It's still that 14th year that finally Rachel gives birth. So that means that he is 77 years old when he flees to Laban. He's 91 when Joseph is born. And Isaac was 60 years old when Esau and Jacob were born. So the 77 plus 60 is how we know that he was 137 at this point. Again, think of the ages. I mean, that means that Jacob was 84 years old when he marries Rachel and Leah. So, folks, we can't equate ages now. I mean, an 84-year-old man marrying somebody who's not looking to start a family. He's at the end of his life in our time. So we have to remember they live longer and they're going to look younger and be able to, because they are younger in many respects. All right, so he calls, Isaac does, because he's old, he calls Esau. One has to wonder if Rebekah ever told Isaac the birth oracle in 25, 21 to 23, where we've already talked about that the older is going to serve the younger. So that meant Esau's not going to be the one that should be blessed. If he did know it, and it just seems almost impossible for us to think he didn't. And I think there's good reason in the text. We're never told if he actually knew it, but there is reason, I think, to believe he did, that he did know what had been said to Rebekah. Then he loved Esau more. That's where that plays into this story. And he tries to surreptitiously, he tries to behind the scenes try to bless Esau rather than Jacob, as God had predicted. Remember that in Jacob's blessing, all the sons are called in chapter 49. And he has some hard things to say to Reuben, but he calls all the sons in when he blesses him. Why does Isaac only call Esau and not Jacob, and at the same time give them both blessing? But he calls Esau his older son, and he feels very strongly that primogeniture, that connection that they would have felt very strongly. All people, it mattered just Isaac and his family, but all people would have felt. But God long ago had settled this. And it's not going to be due to Esau's lack of spirituality or Jacob's deceptive and conniving ways, but solely due to the fact that God picked. Now, in the end, yes, Esau's going to show himself to have a horrible character, and Jacob's going to grow out of that. He's going to grow into a man of faith. So we would think naturally that God would pick someone. I mean, can you imagine picking a Jezebel to give birth to Jesus? But picking Mary and picking Joseph, people of great faith, to do that. At verse 4, Isaac says that my soul may bless you before I die. Blessings would have been very common in the ancient Near East. We can read them in records. In fact, R.K. Harrison says, in effect, they were last will and testaments of the person who uttered them, and as such, they were legally binding, whether they were committed to writing or not. The spoken word had that power. But there's another aspect to the blessings that the patriarchs uttered, and that is they are prophetic. You remember in chapter 20, verse 7, Abraham is called a prophet. God calls him a prophet and tells Abimelech there to seek out him and pray for him. For he's a prophet. He'll pray for you and your house will be healed. So a prophet speaks for the Lord. That's what the word means, to speak forth. And what they say carries not only the weight of the legality that all peoples would recognize, but more than that, God is guiding their words. They are speaking words that come from God. And so they're prophecy, as we would understand. Now, Rebecca, verse 5, is eavesdropping. She's listening. The family's not working together. Isaac's favoring Esau. Rebecca's favoring Jacob. Jacob's plotting and succeeds in getting Esau to sell his birthright. It's a mess, as we see in a lot of the families that come out. They do good things and they do bad things, but they're just like us. Verse 5 and 6, Isaac speaks to his son Esau, the text says, and Rebekah said to her son Jacob. So again, the parental favoritism is going to blow this whole thing up. God has chosen, he would have brought his word to pass no matter what. All these shenanigans that they're going to pull in this chapter, God clearly could have accomplished without that, but he uses it and will accomplish it nonetheless. So at verse 7, this is what Rebekah says to Jacob, that I heard him say to Esau that he may bless you before the Lord before I die. Now, if you go back and read what Isaac actually said, he didn't say the Lord, but that is the important. And Rebekah is saying exactly the heightened sense of the sacred and irrevocable character of the blessing because it's prophetic. Now, whether Rebekah operates at all with a view of the Abrahamic covenant, God certainly does. And God is going to use their shenanigans, all the things that happen in this chapter, to further his command. Long afterward, Jacob would discover and know that none of that had to happen. You remember Joseph brings Manasseh and Ephraim, and Jacob crosses his hands and is going to bless the younger over the older. And Joseph doesn't like that and tries to switch his hands. He says, Jacob just says, not so. But he's going to be he's going to have great people, but Ephraim's going to be greater. And that's the way it should have been done. Should have been done here. But for whatever reason, and I think we can suggest why, Isaac is trying to bless Esau over Jacob. Now, Jacob's clearly worried about how are they going to deceive. Obviously, Isaac can't see, but he says the very important point. Esau is a hairy man. Remember, we saw that at his birth, and I am a smooth man. Now, Rebekah has cooked for Isaac a long time. She may be able to fool his palate and his taste buds. And Jacob probably tried to mimic the voice of Esau, I would think, unsuccessfully, because his father, blind people sometimes, we often hear this, of their other senses are accentuated because of the fact that they've lost the one. But how are we going to get by the touch, the sense of touch? How do you fool Jacob's blindness there? And instead, I'll be cursed by my father rather than blessed. But she sends him out to get 2 goats from the kids of the goats and to prepare it to taste like the wild game. His mother prepared the delicious food, verse 14. Verse 15, she takes garments, the very best garments of Esau that she had in her house, her tent, and the smell of the outdoorsman, the smell that would have been with Esau. Nothing's left to chance. When Isaac will draw Jacob close, you'll be able to smell that at verse 27. And at verse 16, and whether she had planned this or it just comes to her mind, when they've cleaned the kids and now they have the skins, she takes the skins of the goats and puts them on the hands of Jacob and on the smooth part of his neck. So that obviously he's all a very hairy guy, and you think about guys you've seen that are like that. At verse 20, or rather right before that, when Jacob enters with the food, Isaac's suspicions are way up. He says, how have you come back so soon and have prepared the food? And Jacob's answer to that is more than he understands. He says, because the Lord your God granted me success. And he had, not because of all the lies and deceptions, the terrible thing that he's pulling on his father right now, but in the sense that God long ago had promised this. And yes, he's bringing success, even using this. Isaac recognizes, he says, you're the voice of Jacob. This doesn't sound like, come near me that I may feel you. And when he feels, of course, the hair of the kid goats on his hand, and he says, the voice is Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And then he smells him at verse 27. I mean, and yet he still asks him at verse 24, are you really my son, Esau? And so Jacob is lying over and over again. He's just a terrible scene when you think about it happening between a father and a son. But nonetheless, then Isaac speaks his blessing. In verse 23, it says, so he blessed him. Verse 27, and he blessed him. So remember, this is a prophetic utterance. So he says to him, first, the dew of heaven, the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine, the physical blessing, as Isaac and Abraham had grown wealthy and more wealthy as time had gone along. Same is going to be true of Jacob. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you, and you will be Lord over your brothers. Now, he only has one brother, Esau, but understanding the propheticness of it is it goes down the line. He is going to be the head of the family and political power over other nations. So Isaac's thinking it's Esau, but he turns the birth oracle into reality, not knowing that he's doing exactly what God said: the older will serve the younger. And then he utters, cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed is everyone who blesses you. Remember, those are the exact words that were spoken by God to Abraham in chapter 12 when he first called him and made the covenant. So these are prophetic utterances that will come to pass, and we're going to see that in just a minute. Now, Jacob is going to pay for his treachery. Isaac will say, your brother has stolen the blessing deceitfully from you. Jacob's going to pay for that. He'll have to flee the comforts of home, be under the rigorous service of his father-in-law Laban for 20 years. I mean, he couldn't foresee what was about to happen to him the next 2 decades. Laban will pull a fast one on him on the very wedding night that he's waited 7 years to marry Rachel, and he'll switch his daughters and give him Leah, and then will give him Rachel on the stipulation, you'll serve me another 7 years. And then finally, Jacob's going to be deceived as he had deceived his own father. His sons will deceive him in the matter with Joseph. And he will think Joseph, his son, is dead, has been killed by a wild animal for 20 years or more before he'll find out that Joseph is alive. All right, almost immediately upon the exit of Jacob from Isaac, Esau arrives, and he's fixed the food. And Esau says, let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me. And Isaac says, who are you? And Esau says, I am your son, your firstborn, Esau. And then here's where I think Isaac knows about the birth oracle, because the text says, then Isaac trembled very violently. Now, that's the way the English Standard translates it, but it really doesn't do justice to the Hebrew. The Hebrew literally says this: he trembled a trembling, a great, unto excess. So why the English words very violently are trying to pull that idea out. You imagine a man who's just literally shaking violently, because I believe he realized at that moment, who was it then that I blessed? He knows who he blessed. And there's not going to be cursing Jacob now. Remember the prophetic nature of what these blessings were. They came from God. And he says, and he will, yes, and he will be blessed. Now, any good lawyer, or bad one for that matter, could void a contract of someone who was lured into it deceptively. If that sort of thing can be shown conclusively in the facts, then you're going to not have to keep that sort of bargain. But Isaac knows God is behind this, and I believe he knows. Isaac knew about the birth oracle, and I believe that trembling violently and saying he's going to be blessed, Isaac tried to go against that in preferring Esau over Jacob, but it was prophetic. The only thing that is said to us about the faith of Isaac, and I believe this is very vital, when Isaac is brought into the hall of faith, as we call Hebrews 11, the only thing said about him, other than when Abraham offered him, but that's focusing on Abraham. In Hebrews 11 and verse 20, it says, by faith. You know how all of those begin, by faith. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. And all the things you can grab out of somebody's life, you grab when Abraham walked away from his kinfolks and went to a land that God had promised. That's a huge step of faith. Or when he offers Isaac, huge step of faith. When he dwells in the land that will never be his, huge step of faith. What's the only thing of a long life, 180 years? The one thing they grabbed in Hebrews 11, the inspired writer, is this story that he invoked the blessings upon Jacob, it says first, and Esau. And I believe that's because Isaac shows his faith. He tried to do something that he knew was going against God's will. And when he knows that God has brought this to pass, he trembles violently and then acknowledges God has done this, basically, and he will be blessed. Leupold says it this way in his commentary: the erring saint, Isaac, had been corrected by God in the midst of his attempt to transfer the blessing. He had accepted the correction and repented. And so in the end, what he did was an act of faith after all. And I think that's exactly right. I think that's what is happening in the story. So the emotion of Esau, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry. And he blames Jacob for being rightly named as a plant or cheat. One of the things that is said about Esau is found in Hebrews, the 12th chapter. And there at verse 16, that there be no one, he says, among the Hebrews that is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau. Think about that. We're supposed to be holy. That is set apart to God. I preached about that last Sunday, and a huge point in the lesson. We're supposed to be God's instruments and be used for him. But Esau's the opposite of that. Don't become like Esau and unholy, who sold his birthright for a single meal. That's what he thought about Abraham. That's what he thought about. What had been promised and passed on through Isaac should have been his. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, that's where we are right now in the story, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. Because again, God is looking at character, and Jacob will become the better man as time will go forward. Esau will never become any better. And the Bible has nothing good to say about him or his descendants. Right, at verse 39 and 40, then he finally does give Esau a blessing, if you can call it a blessing. He says, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be. The opposite of what Jacob is giving, the dew of heaven, the fatness of the earth. Edom is going to be a bleak, and it is, if you know where it is, the map, rocky, barren land, not fertile, but unfruitful. By your sword you shall live. Esau's lot's going to be violence and conflict, money taking plunder from others, become marauders and thieves, as we would say. And you shall serve your brother. So the very thing that had been said in the oracle is the birth oracle is going to be true of his descendants. So the very first time we see that is the Edomites are defeated by King Saul in 1 Samuel 14. They're subjugated by David in 2 Samuel 8, verse 14. Remember, a number of Edomites are slaughtered by David. They remain under Judah until King Joram in the divided kingdom. They're subdued again by Amaziah in 2 Kings chapter 14 and 2 Chronicles 25. They remain in subjection to King Uzziah and King Jotham in 2 Kings 14 again and 2 Chronicles 26. And at the reign of Ahaz, they finally break off the reign of Ahaz in Judah, shake the yoke of Judah entirely. And he said that in this prophecy blessing, you shall break his yoke from your neck. It was into the intertestament period then that John Hyrcanus in 129 BC compelled the Edomites to be submitting to circumcision. They were brought into nominally to the Jewish state, and they were then known as Idumeans. So instead of Edom, E-D-O-M, it's I-D-U-M as it comes down to us. And from them, as you know, come the Herods. So the very Herods that are the ones who plot against Jesus, the King Herod the Great tried to kill the baby Jesus, are the very descendants of Esau. So nothing's ever good said about Esau and the descendants of Esau. They are the antithesis of godliness and holiness, and stand in the Bible as an example of that. Well, verse 41 says that Esau's hatred turns to vengeance, and he plots to kill Jacob after Isaac dies. He believes Isaac will die soon, but that's not going to happen, as we said, for another 43 years. And so Esau again clearly shows that he's of the line of Cain and Lamech, who will murder. In John 8, it talks about the murderousness of the Jews against him. The words of Esau, though, were told to Rebekah. He didn't keep that to himself. He didn't keep quiet about it. And so when she hears about it, she tells Jacob, "Flee to my brother Laban." So she's going to, as she had been found by the steward of Abraham and brought back, go to my brother and stay with him for a while, she says, until your brother's fury turns away and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you from there. And she could have not ever known that her son will stay there for 20 years with Laban and never see Rebekah alive again. Rebekah dies. We don't know anything about her death. We only know because Jacob says to us in chapter 49:31 that when he wants to be buried, he says, Abraham and Sarah buried in the cave of Machpelah, Isaac and Rebekah, and there I buried Leah, and there bury me. And so that's the only thing we know about her death. She was buried in the cave of Machpelah. And she truly does. She said, "Why should I be bereft of both my sons this day?" But in effect, she is bereft of them. By the actions that she has pulled, she has set in motion that type of thing. And she is bereft of both of them because of the way Esau himself becomes. All right, so that sets us up then for Rebekah putting to Isaac the idea that the two that Esau has married are just grief of mind to them. Send him back to my people, people, your kinfolks, and let's find a wife for Jacob there. And so under that pretense, she gets Isaac in the next chapter that we'll come to next week to send Jacob to Padan Aram. All right, thank you for your attention, and I hope this has helped.